In Hesiod's Theogony, among the lines that name the children of Zeus and Hera, there is a moment that takes almost no time at all. The name Ares appears. The line moves on. No story accompanies it. No elaboration is offered. No ceremony marks the naming of a god who would one day be understood as war itself made divine. Hesiod sets him down beside his siblings, Hebe, cupbearer to the gods, and Eileithyia, who presided over childbirth, and continues without pause, as though the name required nothing further, as though the god it belonged to had arrived in the record with everything already decided about him, and nothing left that needed saying. This was around the 7th century before the Common Era, in a poem that gave the Greek cosmos its most comprehensive early shape. Hesiod was assembling the gods in their relationships and their genealogies, tracing the great lines of divine descent from chaos onward. And the children of Zeus and Hera occupied a specific and distinguished place in that architecture. Two fully divine parents, both of them ruling gods, a lineage that was, by any formal measure, among the most illustrious an Olympian could hold. And yet the line about Ares is brief. The brevity itself is the first interesting thing about him. There is a quality to that brevity worth sitting with for a moment. Hesiod was not a careless writer. His poem is meticulous in its attention to divine genealogy, to the relationships between gods, and the particular powers each one carried. When a figure mattered to him, he said so. When a birth had a story worth telling, he told it. The Theogony gives considerable space to the violent and dramatic origin of Aphrodite, born from the sea foam around the severed genitals of Uranus after Cronus cast them into the water. It gives space to the remarkable origin of Athena, who emerged fully formed and in full armor from the head of Zeus himself after he swallowed her mother Metis. These were births that the tradition found worth describing, origins whose strangeness or drama carried meaning about the kind of god who arrived through them. Ares receives a line. He is named. Hesiod moves on, and in that brevity, written onto whatever surface carried the poem from one generation to the next, there is something that would prove entirely characteristic of how the Greek tradition held this particular god, present in the record, formally accounted for, and somehow never quite the subject of the attention the record was keeping. The image of it is oddly specific when the mind settles on it. A scribe, or poet working in the early Greek tradition, setting down the names of Zeus and Hera's children, moving from one name to the next with the particular rhythm of a list: Hebe, Eileithyia, Ares, Ares. The names placed in the same line, the way a document places items that must be noted, each one given its syllables, and then released. The papyrus or skin or wax holding that line for centuries and then millennia, carrying a god's name in its matter-of-fact company, as though the name were simply a fact requiring no further comment, which, in a certain sense, is exactly how the tradition seems to have held it. Born of two ruling gods placed on the list and given no story of arrival, that was how Ares entered the Greek mythological record. The fact is quiet and a little strange. The two parents whose union produced him were themselves among the most significant figures in the Greek cosmos. Zeus, the king of the Olympians, held authority over sky and thunder and the broad structure of divine order. Hera, his wife and sister, was queen of the gods, presiding over marriage and the ordering of the domestic and political spheres that made civilization possible. Their union was the central dynastic fact of the Olympian arrangement, and the children it produced should, by any reasonable expectation of how divine genealogy worked, have been gods who embodied the most honored and central qualities of the order their parents maintained. Some of those children did carry that weight. He personified youth and served as cupbearer at the divine feasts. Elathia governed childbirth, a domain so fundamental to human experience that her cult spread across much of the Greek world, and her presence was invoked at moments of the most urgent necessity. These were figures whose divine functions threaded through daily life in ways that made their parentage feel appropriate. Gods of the ruling household who presided over the things a ruling household ought to care about. Their lineage and their portfolios matched. Ares was war. Specifically, Ares was the raw fact of war, the blood and noise and frenzy of it, the part of armed conflict that existed before and below strategy or courage or any of the qualities the Greeks found admirable in a soldier. His domain was not disputed. His seat among the 12 Olympians, the canonical assembly that governed the major areas of divine and human concern, was formally his. He held it, but the tradition seems to have understood from early on that there was something mismatched between the lineage and the portfolio, between the distinguished parentage and the particular gift the son had been given to bring to the world. The Olympian assembly itself is worth pausing at for a moment, because it is the frame within which Ares's position becomes most clearly visible. The 12 gods who sat in that assembly between them covered almost every domain that mattered to a Greek city in the fullness of its life. Athena, who shared her father's head as a birthplace, held the realms of wisdom, craft, and the disciplined, ordered dimension of warfare, the kind of war that Apollos could choose and conduct with intelligence. Apollo governed music, prophecy, medicine, and the light of reason. Demeter presided over the growth of grain, which meant she presided over the survival of communities through every winter. Poseidon held the sea, which meant he held the trade routes and the fishing grounds and the weather that determined whether ships came home. Hermes moved between worlds, carrying messages and guiding the dead. Artemis governed the hunt in the wild places. Hephaestus made things, forged them from fire and metal, created the tools and weapons and objects of beauty that civilization depended on. The list, taken together, reads as a map of the things a Greek city needed to persist and flourish: agriculture, trade, medicine, the arts, the ordered management of conflict, the crafting of useful things, divine protection in the movement of daily life, from birth to marriage to death. When the Greeks assembled their gods in their 12 canonical seats, they were assembling, in a sense, a picture of what they valued, the domains they considered worth placing under divine authority, the aspects of existence they wanted to feel were held and watched over by something greater than themselves. Ares sat among those 12. His seat was his, but his domain war pursued for its own sake. Violence in its most irrational and aimless form was not a domain that Greek cities built their calendars or their civic identity around. The others were celebrated through festivals and harvests and healings and the launching of ships. The domain of Ares was endured. It was not, in any comfortable sense of the word, welcomed. This is the quality of his position that becomes interesting when the mind dwells on it at length. Not tragic, not dramatic, more like the mild, persistent oddness of a formal arrangement that is never quite resolved into a comfortable fit. He was of the ruling house. He occupied an official seat. He was, in every genealogical and institutional sense, a full member of the divine assembly. And yet the tradition that preserved his name and his lineage also preserved, with equal consistency, the understanding that he was the least beloved figure in that assembly, tolerated because the domain he embodied was unavoidable, because war was a fact of human life that required a divine home, but never celebrated for anything he brought that the others wished they had. There is an alternative account of his origins that sits at an interesting angle to the Hesiodic version, and it comes from a much later source, Ovid, writing in the Roman period, in a poem called the Fasti. Ovid describes an occasion on which Hera, stung by the fact that Zeus had produced Athena entirely from his own head, without any female participation in the birth, sought out the goddess Flora and asked for her assistance. Flora was a goddess whose domain was flowers and spring growth, and she possessed, according to Ovid's account, a particular flower with an unusual property, a bloom capable of inducing conception at a touch. Flora gave the flower to Hera. Hera touched it, and from that contact, without Zeus, without any act of union between two parents, she conceived the child who would become Ares. The image Ovid creates is a quiet one and worth holding gently. Flora placing a single flower, described in the Fasti as growing in a field, that Flora kept, a bloom unremarkable in appearance, not particularly large or luminous or dramatic, into the palm of the Queen of the Gods. The flower small against that divine hand, the act of giving it simple and unhurried, one goddess offering a practical gift to another, and in that touch, something beginning that would take a form no one watching the exchange could have anticipated. What is interesting about this alternative account is what it suggests about the narrative logic the tradition brought to Ares' origins. In the Hesiodic version, his birth is a matter of brief and formal record, the son of Zeus and Hera, named and placed on the list. In Ovid's version, his conception is an act of wounded pride, a response to a kind of exclusion, a god made not in the ordinary course of divine union, but in a gesture of independence from a queen who felt that the fundamental act of creation had been taken from her. Neither version is the origin story. They are two of the accounts that survived, two of the ways the tradition tried to make sense of this particular god and where he came from. But there is something in the Ovidian account that resonates with the position Ares would hold throughout the mythological tradition, as though his very origins carried a slight note of irregularity, a small distance from the center of things, a beginning that was already slightly sideways from what the other gods had. Born of a flower, in the service of a grievance, from the palm of the queen of the gods, rather than from any straightforward divine union. The story does not make him lesser. It makes him, even at the beginning, slightly different, placed in the record with an asterisk that no one quite bothered to explain. His worship in the ancient Greek world was real, if distributed unevenly across the landscape of divine cult. Sparta, the city-state that organized its entire civic identity around military discipline and the production of soldiers, gave Ares significant cultic attention, which made a certain kind of sense, since a city that defined itself through warfare would naturally wish to maintain a relationship with the god who embodied it. The Spartans had a particular cult of Ares that scholars understand as reflecting their broader orientation toward martial life, the god's domain given weight in a community that had decided war was the central fact of its existence. Thrace, a region to the north of the Greek heartland, the territory that the Greeks associated with barbarian roughness, and the kind of people who existed, in the Greek imagination, at the edge of the civilized world, was also understood to be Ares' home territory. The connection was not coincidental. When the Greeks imagined where a god of unrestrained violence and bloodlust might feel most at home, they imagined him in the cold and wild places, at the boundary of the world they recognized, in the company of the peoples they regarded as least shaped by the ordering principles of civilization. Thrace was a way of locating Ares, imaginate tracts, placing him at a distance from the polis, from the feast day, from the garlanded temple and the civic calendar. A modest precinct in a harsh landscape, a god whose most comfortable home was somewhere the Greeks preferred to keep at arm's length. There were shrines to Ares across the Greek world because the domain he governed was unavoidable, and because a domain that's significant required divine acknowledgement somewhere in the religious architecture of any community that might need to go to war. But the quality of devotion given to those shrines was different from the devotion given to a god like Athena or Apollo or Demeter. Offerings to Ares were made, but they were made with something closer to acknowledgement than to celebration, the recognition that war existed and required its god, not the warm and reciprocal relationship between a community and a deity who gave something the community actively desired. Athens is the clearest illustration of this. Athens was, in the ancient world, one of the most significant religious centers of the Greek tradition, and the hill called the Areopagus, the Hill of Ares, stands at the edge of the city, a weathered outcrop of gray limestone, visible from below the Acropolis, low and flat-topped and old in a way that the stone itself communicates without needing to say anything. The name is Ares's. It has been Ares's since before the historical record is clear enough to say exactly when it began. Areospagos, the Rock of Ares, a name that the city built itself around the way a city builds itself, around any persistent geographical fact, accepting the feature as part of the landscape without necessarily dwelling on what it means. The Areopagus served in Athenian civic life as the site of the ancient council that bore its name, the council that, according to various Athenian traditions, presided over homicide cases and certain constitutional questions, a body whose authority was old enough that its origins were explained by myth rather than history. The name Ares was therefore present in Athenian civic and legal life through the hill's name and the council's name in a way that gave the god a structural presence in the city, even when his actual cultic practice there was minimal. And that is the interesting detail. The hill bears his name. The council bears the hill's name. The god is, in that sense, written into the city's structure. But the city's actual devotion, its grandest temple, its most famous festival, its most treasured divine relationship, belonged entirely and overwhelmingly to Athena. The Parthenon stands on the Acropolis above the Areopagus, gleaming white in the accounts that describe it in its prime, housing the great statue of the goddess, the center of the city's sacred identity. The Panathenaic festival, the most significant religious celebration in the Athenian calendar, was dedicated to Athena. The city understood itself as Athena's city in a way that was inseparable from how it understood its own character, wisdom, craft, the ordered management of power, the civic mind that built things worth building. Ares's name was on the rock below. It had always been there. But the city had arranged its prayers and its temples and its civic festivals around the goddess on the hill above, and the distance between those two positions, the rock with the name and the temple with the devotion, was, in a sense, the distance the Greek tradition as a whole had placed between acknowledgement and affection. The 12 Olympians, taken together, represent one of the most enduring theological arrangements in ancient Greek religious thought. The exact composition of the 12 varied somewhat by period and locality. Different cities emphasized different gods. Different traditions included or excluded figures at the margins of the canonical 12. But the core of the assembly was consistent across most of the ancient Greek world, and the idea of 12 gods presiding together over the domains of human experience was a settled and widely shared religious conception. Altars to the 12 Olympians stood in public spaces. Cities built their religious calendars around the 12 in aggregate, moving through the year with attention distributed across the assembly, each god receiving the season and the festival and the offering appropriate to the domain they held. Within that arrangement, the position of each god was defined partly by the domain they held, and partly by the way the domain fit into the texture of daily life. A god whose domain touched on something that occurred regularly and required ongoing relationship. Demeter with the harvest, Apollo with healing and prophecy, Hermes with travel and commerce, accumulated cultic richness through the accumulated weight of those daily and seasonal contacts. People went to Demeter's temples not because they had decided to be devout, but because the grain was not growing and they needed it to. People went to Apollo's sanctuaries because someone in the household was ill and medicine and prayer were not yet distinguishable from each other. The relationship between a community and its gods was in a significant sense practical, built from the specific needs that arose in the course of living. Ares's domain did not sustain that kind of ongoing daily life contact. War came in seasons, not in the steady rhythm of harvest and planting and healing. It was not a relationship people maintained through habit and necessity, but one they found themselves confronting at irregular intervals, often unwillingly. The god of war had no festival equivalent to the Thesmophoria, no oracle equivalent to Delphi, no healing sanctuary equivalent to the great precincts of Asclepius. What he had was acknowledgement, the recognition that his domain existed, and that a domain so significant required a divine address. But acknowledgement is not the same as warmth, and the record of Ares's cultic life across the Greek world reflects that distinction consistently. He was the son of Zeus and Hera. There was no question about the lineage. There was no uncertainty about the seat. The 12 Olympians included him. The canonical list placed him there, and the formal architecture of Greek religion gave him his due as a god whose domain was real and whose membership in the divine assembly was not in doubt. But the tradition that preserved all of this also preserved, with the quiet thoroughness of a record that notes what it observes without requiring it to be explained, the consistent and widely shared sense that of all the gods who sat in that assembly, Ares was the one the room had most quietly agreed to include without particularly celebrating. There is something oddly restful in dwelling on that position for a while, in the dark and the quiet, not because it is sad. The tradition does not frame it as sad, and there is no particular reason to import that reading into a god whose nature was what it was, more because the image itself has an interesting quality, a kind of formal precision about it. A god with every qualification of lineage and standing, a recognized seat, a name on a hill in the city that belonged to someone else, the record acknowledging him in its careful way, Hesiod setting the name down in the list alongside the siblings, the line moving on. The Greek tradition was attentive to distinctions of this kind. The difference between having a name in the formal record and being actively beloved, the difference between holding a seat in the assembly and being the figure the assembly organized itself around, the difference between a domain that was unavoidable and one that was desired. Ares occupied, in the tradition's careful accounting, the space where those distinctions were most visible, the god whose formal position was unimpeachable and whose warmth of reception was from very early on something the sources found no compelling reason to exaggerate. Flora's flower, Hesiod's list, the Areopagus below the Acropolis. These are the images the tradition left, specific, unglamorous, quiet in their way. A small bloom passed from one hand to another in a story the Roman poet thought was worth telling. A name placed in a line among siblings with no story attached, the poet moving on to other things. a hill in Athens with a god's name worn into its stone, bearing that name through centuries, while the city's eyes moved upward toward the gleaming white temple on the height above it. None of these images carry urgency. None of them require anything from the person holding them in mind. They are simply the shape of a particular inheritance, the specific contours of how one Olympian came to hold a position that was formally distinguished and practically awkward, a seat at the table of the gods from which the view was, always of the attention being given to the others. The Areopagus still stands in Athens. The gray limestone is still there, flat-topped and low, the same outcrop that gave the god his foothold in the city's name. The Parthenon is still visible from its base, still holding its height above the city, still the thing the eye is drawn toward when the surrounding landscape is taken in. The name of Ares is in the rock and in the ancient designation of the council that met there, syllables that have been in that place for long enough that their origin is mythological rather than historical, a god's name given to a hill so early in the city's life that no document recorded the giving. It is a quiet kind of presence, a name outlasting the particular attention that the city chose, in the end, to direct toward someone else. The hill holding its designation across the centuries, the ancient syllables still there, in the stone, while the devotion that might have accompanied them settled, long ago, and quite comfortably higher up the slope. Whatever the stories about Ares would go on to hold, and the tradition held many, they began here in the simplest possible terms: a name in a list, a seat in an assembly, a distinguished lineage that the record noted without particular elaboration. The ink moving on, the poem continuing past the name into whatever it was going to say next. Ares, son of Zeus and Hera, placed in the theogony beside his siblings, the line carrying no ceremony around a god who would in time be associated with the loudest and most disruptive forces the Greek imagination could conceive. Hesiod moved on, the tradition moved on, the name stayed on the hill, and somewhere in the distance between where the Areopagus sits in the city and where the Parthenon rises above it, in the gray weathered limestone, holding that old name in its ancient syllables, there is the particular quality of a position that was never quite disputed and never quite celebrated, a god written into the landscape of a city that built its grandest temple to someone else, the name still there, the stone still holding it, the long Athenian afternoon settling quietly around the hill, and the inscription it has always carried. Zeus does not shout when he speaks to Ares in the 5th book of the Iliad. That is the first thing worth noticing. The king of the gods, looking at his wounded son standing before the Olympian court with ichor leaking from his side, and all the noise of his fury still present in the hall, delivers his verdict without raising his voice. What Homer gives him is something flatter than anger and more final, the tone of someone confirming a long-held opinion that events have simply furnished with another example. Ares is, Zeus says, the most hateful of all the gods who hold Olympus, and if he were not his own son, Zeus adds, he would long since have found himself in Tartarus, cast down with the Titans who preceded the Olympians, and who were placed there, in the Greek understanding, because they had no further function in a world the new gods now governed. There is a particular quality to a condemnation delivered without heat. The absence of anger is in some ways more telling than anger would be. Anger implies that the transgression was unexpected, that the person who has disappointed you was previously thought capable of something better. What Zeus offers Ares in this moment is colder than that, and carries within it a much longer history. The judgment reads less like a response to what Ares has just done on the battlefield outside Troy, and more like a settled conclusion about what Ares simply is, a conclusion that has, if anything, been confirmed once again. The divine court on Olympus is worth picturing for a moment, because Homer understood it as a place of genuine assembly. The gods gathered there were not scattered across independent kingdoms without knowledge of each other. They occupied, in the Greek imagination, a shared council that met, that argued, that held opinions about each other, and expressed them. It was a court, in something like the social sense, a place where standing mattered, where allegiances were observed, where certain behaviors were understood to embarrass or diminish the figure who displayed them. And Ares, who stands at the center of this scene, having just abandoned a battlefield and fled to his father, is not a figure commanding the room's sympathy. He is the god of war, come home from the fighting, covered in the evidence of his own incapacity. The reason Zeus's condemnation carries the weight it does has something to do with what Ares was understood to be, and that understanding was both specific and consistent across the Greek tradition. War, for the Greeks, was not a single thing. It had more than one divine patron, and the difference between those patrons was the whole difference between two entirely distinct ways of approaching conflict. Ares represented one of them, Athena represented the other, and the Greek tradition made no effort to disguise which of the two it valued. Ares, in the oldest stratum of his character, was associated not with any particular military outcome, but with the quality of war itself, when all discipline and strategy have been stripped away. The state of battle, when it has become pure momentum, when soldiers are no longer fighting toward any objective, but simply fighting, when the thing has ceased to be a human endeavor and become something more elemental and less rational. The Greek word that attaches most consistently to him is not a word for courage or victory, but a word closer to bloodlust, or to battle frenzy, the state that warriors were understood to enter when the normal constraints of the mind had been overtaken by the overwhelming immediacy of mortal combat. This was not a condition the Greeks looked upon with admiration. It was a condition they recognized, named, and kept at arm's length. Athena, whose domains overlapped with Ares's own in ways that required the tradition to articulate the difference clearly, was associated with war conducted through reason, the strategic planning of campaigns, the disciplined formation of armies, the application of intelligence to the problem of defeating an enemy without being destroyed in the process. What she governed was war as the polis required it to function, war as the defense of the city, and the execution of necessary political objectives. The Greeks built temples to her. They consulted her before campaigns. They placed her at the center of the Athenian civic identity in a way that made her name nearly synonymous with the city's own conception of itself. Ares received nothing comparable to this, because the Greek civic tradition had, in an important sense, nothing comparable to offer him. What he personified was not useful to a city in peacetime, and in wartime it was something to be managed and minimized rather than invited and celebrated. The distinction is worth dwelling on because it explains what might otherwise seem like a strange inconsistency, that the god of war was the least respected of the 12 Olympians at a time when war was a constant and defining feature of Greek life. The Greeks were not people who turned from war. They fought frequently. They organized their states around military capacity. They built monuments to their victories. But they did not worship what Ares embodied, because what Ares embodied was precisely the aspect of war they were most determined to keep under control. To honor Ares would have been to honor the thing that made war catastrophic, rather than the thing that made war effective. Athena's domain was war made useful. Ares's domain was war made unleashed. And the difference between those two things was, in the Greek understanding, the difference between a society that persisted and one that destroyed itself. This is what Zeus's rebuke carries beneath its cold words. The condemnation is not merely personal, it is structural. A god whose entire nature consists of war without wisdom, loyalty, or purpose. A god whose presence on any side of a conflict is understood to degrade rather than strengthen that side, has no natural place in the architecture of divine governance as the Greeks conceived it. The 12 Olympians together formed something like a complete account of how the world worked and what human beings needed to flourish within it. Agriculture, medicine, the arts, the sea, the forge, the harvest, love, the sun. These were the domains of Olympus, and between them they covered everything a Greek city required to exist and thrive. Ares's domain stood apart from all of them. It had no peacetime form. Homer's Iliad, composed in the tradition of oral poetry that the Greeks understood as their oldest and most authoritative account of the divine world, takes every opportunity to make this hierarchy visible. The war poem is, in a certain sense, structured around the contrast between Ares and Athena, between the frenzied violence the war god represents and the strategic intelligence the goddess of wisdom brings to the same battlefield. And the poem does not sustain ambiguity about which of them has the Greeks' respect. Ares's scenes in the Iliad consistently end in some form of diminishment. Athena's scenes consistently end in something more like order or achievement, or the satisfying completion of an intelligently formed plan. Among the episodes that most clearly embody this contrast, one stands at the end of the 21st book of the Iliad. The gods themselves have entered the fighting, what Homer calls the Theomachy, the battle among the immortals, and Athena and Ares find themselves in direct confrontation. What happens next is narrated with a quality of restraint that sits strangely alongside the scale of what it describes. Ares moves against Athena, and Athena stops his attack, not with divine lightning, not with the kind of spectacular cosmic force the epic reserves for Zeus, but with a stone taken from the plain of Troy. The Iliad specifies what kind of stone it is, a boundary marker, one of those flat-topped rocks that men had placed there in some earlier generation to establish where one property ended and the next began, an ordinary object used to delimit a small human claim on a small piece of the physical world. Athena lifts this stone and brings it down on Ares, and Ares falls. He covers 7 roods of ground as he collapses, which the Iliad offers without commentary, as though the measurement of a fallen god's extent is simply a detail worth recording. The whole episode is rendered with a kind of efficient practicality that the Greeks clearly understood as the point. The boundary stone, human in origin, practical in purpose, unremarkable in material, is the correct instrument for settling this particular argument. The god of uncontrolled violence is stopped, not by a weapon, but by the artifact of an ordinary social convention, a stone that meant stop here. A stone that said, in the physical language of property and agreement, this far and no farther. The humor in this is not difficult to find if it is looked for, and the Greeks found it and preserved it. Homer's scene is written with a kind of deadpan exactness that is not entirely unfunny. The war god knocked flat by a boundary stone, while the goddess of wisdom stands over him and then simply continues to whatever she needed to do next. There is nothing in the Iliad's telling of this moment that lingers on Ares's condition or savors his defeat. Athena deals with the problem and moves on, which is itself a comment on how seriously the tradition took him. The gods who observe all of this from the heights of Olympus include Aphrodite, who comes to help Ares recover, supporting him and helping him rise from the ground, and whom Athena then knocks down as well with a single strike to the chest, so that both of them are left on the ground on the plain of Troy, while Athena turns her attention back to the larger shape of the battle. Homer gives Hera a line of satisfied commentary at this point, and Hera's satisfaction is interesting in its own right because it brings into the scene the most uncomfortable dimension of Ares' isolation, the fact that his own mother is among those who find his defeats unremarkable. Hera, queen of the Olympians, wife of Zeus, mother of Ares, appears in the Iliad's treatment of the war not as the defender of her son, but in consistent and active opposition to him. In the 5th book, before Athena strikes him with the stone in the 21st, Hera is already doing something that requires some attention. She grants to the Greek hero Diomedes, a mortal, a fighter of enormous skill but still mortal, the ability to perceive gods on the battlefield and to strike them with his weapons. And then she goes further. She and Athena move against Ares together, a pair of divine women cooperating to diminish and wound a god who happens to be Hera's own child. The tradition never explains this as a conflict between Hera and Ares that has a personal history. It is not narrated as a feud or a grievance. What Homer presents is simpler and stranger than that. Hera opposes Ares on the battlefield of Troy because she has chosen the Greek side in this war, and Ares has chosen the Trojan side, and the forces dividing the gods in this conflict cut straight through family lines without ceremony. But there is an additional weight to Hera's participation in her son's defeat that the poem seems aware of and that it declines to resolve. She does not hold back because he is her son. She acts against him with the same decisive clarity she brings to every other choice she makes in the Iliad. The maternal restraint that might complicate this situation in a story governed by different values is simply absent. Ares is, in Hera's participation in his defeat, treated as one more obstacle to the outcome she has decided to pursue. This is a feature of the Olympian world that the Greek tradition accepted without apparent discomfort. The gods had family relationships, but those relationships did not automatically produce loyalty or affection. Zeus married Hera. They had children together. Those children occupied the divine court alongside their parents. None of this prevented Zeus from declaring that one of those children was the most hateful being on Olympus, or Hera from allying with Athena to wound him on a battlefield. The family structure of Olympus created proximity, not warmth. It created obligation in certain formal senses, without creating the emotional texture that the word family might suggest. What the Greek tradition seems to have found in this, and what it preserved with considerable care across centuries of retelling, was a way of mapping a particular social observation onto divine persons. Ares was the god whom even his own family found difficult to love. He had the right parentage. He had the right seat at the table. He occupied the position that was his by divine inheritance, and none of it translated into the regard that his position would seem to promise. He was, in the Greek mythological imagination, a figure of impeccable credentials and no affection, and this was understood to follow directly from his nature rather than from any particular story of injury or wrongdoing. Every other god on Olympus held a domain that tied them to the life Greeks actually wanted to live. Apollo presided over music, over prophecy, over medicine, over the archer's controlled and purposeful aim. He was the god of distance, made precise, of the far target hit with patient skill, of the healing art that opposed the body's dissolution. Demeter governed the grain and the harvest and the annual return of growing things, without which the Greek world starved. Poseidon held the sea, and the sea was where Greek trade moved, and where Greek military power could be projected. Hephaestus worked the forge, and the forge was where Greek civilization made the tools and weapons and objects of beauty that distinguished it from what the Greeks imagined barbarian existence to be. Hermes moved between the worlds of gods and men, carrying messages, guiding souls, presiding over trade and language and the cunning exchange of one thing for another. Even Aphrodite, whose domain was desire and therefore capable of causing considerable disruption, was woven into the fabric of peacetime life through her associations with beauty, procreation, and the bonds between people that made communities cohere. What Ares offered had no peacetime form. He presided over the moment a battle became a slaughter, over the quality of combat when all discipline had been abandoned, over the aspect of war that neither side in any conflict actually wants to encounter in their own troops. The Greek polis organized itself around war. It trained for war. It went to war regularly and treated military success as one of the highest forms of civic achievement. But the war it organized and trained for was the war of Athena's domain, purposeful, strategic, conducted by disciplined men toward a defined objective. The war of Ares's domain was what those same men became when the battle had gone on too long and too badly, when the rational direction of violence had collapsed and something animal had taken its place. This was not a condition the polis sought to honor. It was a condition the polis spent considerable effort trying to prevent. The Olympian feast calendar, as practiced in the Greek cities of the classical period, moved through the year in a sequence of celebrations that mapped the divine world onto the rhythms of civic and agricultural life. There were festivals for Demeter at planting and harvest. There were festivals for Apollo, for Hermes, for Hephaestus, for Dionysus, for Poseidon. Athena's great festival in Athens, the Panathenaea, was among the most elaborate gatherings of the Athenian year, involving processions and games, and the ritual renewal of the goddess's relationship with the city that bore her name. These celebrations were not merely religious in the narrow modern sense. They were the social fabric of the polis, made visible, the community's collective affirmation of what it valued and what it depended on. In this calendar, in these celebrations, Ares was largely absent. His name did not mark a season. His worship did not organize a month. The civic life of the Greek city passed through its year without a regular pause at the domain of the war god, and this absence was not an oversight. It was the natural expression of a coherent set of values. Ares had no gift to give the city in its peacetime life. What he embodied arrived only in seasons of killing, and it was not, even then, the thing the city prayed to cultivate in its own soldiers. When a Greek general prepared for battle, he sacrificed to the gods whose favor mattered for the outcome he sought, to Athena, to Zeus, to the divine forces that governed the strategic and the ordered dimensions of armed conflict. Ares was not typically the object of these prayers, because what Ares represented was not precisely what a Greek general wanted his army to become. The structural logic of this arrangement, once it is seen, has a kind of quiet completeness to it. The Greeks did not have to argue against Ares. They did not have to explain or defend his absence from their celebrations. The logic was already present in the nature of what he personified. A war god who embodied war's most destructive and irrational aspects could not, by definition, be the object of the prayers of a people who wanted war to go well for them. To ask Ares for his particular form of help was to ask for something that could not be distinguished from catastrophe. Zeus's words in the 5th book of the Iliad are, in this light, more than a father's cold rebuke of a difficult son. They are the whole Greek philosophical tradition's assessment of what Ares represented: concentrated into a few lines that Homer placed in the mouth of the king of the gods, and that the Greek tradition chose to preserve and repeat across centuries. The most hateful of all the Olympians, if not my own son, already in Tartarus. These are not casual insults, they are a verdict, delivered by the figure with the authority to deliver verdicts about the divine world, on the question of what place a god like Ares occupies in the order of things. He occupies his place, he holds his seat, he cannot be removed, because war cannot be removed, and the Greeks had no illusion that it could be, but he is held at the exact distance that his nature requires. There is something worth noticing in the specificity of the comparison Zeus makes. Tartarus was not merely a prison in the Greek cosmological imagination. It was the place where the Titans had been confined after Zeus and his siblings had defeated them and taken governance of the cosmos for themselves. The Titans were the generation before the Olympians, the powers that had organized the world before the current order was established, and their confinement in Tartarus was the mythological expression of the idea that the world had moved past what they represented, that their mode of operating had been superseded by a better and more ordered arrangement. To say that Ares would be in Tartarus with the Titans if he were not Zeus's son is to say something quite specific about the kind of divine power Ares embodies. It is to suggest that what Ares is belongs to an older, less ordered world, to the period before the gods had worked out how to govern things properly, before the current arrangement had settled into its careful distribution of domains and responsibilities. This implication sits quietly in the text. Homer does not elaborate on it. Zeus says what he says, and the scene moves on. But the comparison connects Ares not to the present order of Olympus, but to the forces that preceded it, and that were, in the Greek mythological understanding, properly confined beneath it. The war god, in this reading, is not merely the least beloved of the 12, but the one whose nature is most reminiscent of what the 12 replaced. The scene in the Iliad, where Athena's stone is applied to this problem, is then something more than a moment of mythological comedy. It is the Greek tradition's most physically specific answer to the question of what should be done with the kind of force Ares represents. The boundary stone, placed there by human hands in some earlier time to establish an ordinary human limit, is the correct instrument, not a divine weapon, not a display of cosmic power, a rock that meant stop here, picked up by a goddess who had a more interesting battle to get back to, and used with the straightforward efficiency of someone applying the minimum necessary force to a problem that does not deserve more. What the Greeks preserved in this image was a way of thinking about the relationship between order and violence that they seem to have found deeply satisfying. The violence that exceeds its purpose, the force that cannot be directed or contained, the battle frenzy that is broken loose from any rational military objective, these things are stopped by the same means a farmer used to stop an argument about property lines. The boundary stone that says here and no further is, in the mythological logic of the scene, exactly right. It is not the scale of Athena's response that matters. It is the precision of it. The instrument matches the problem. The problem, for all its divine scale, is fundamentally a problem of something exceeding its proper limits. The solution is the thing that limits are made of. Ares, flat on the plain of Troy covering 7 roods of ground, is in this moment the mythological image of a force that has been correctly measured. He is not destroyed. He will rise again. He will return to Olympus and receive his father's rebuke, and presumably do more or less the same things again the next time the conditions summon him. The tradition does not offer a resolution in which Ares is reformed or absorbed into a more productive role in the divine order. He remains what he is. The other gods remain what they are in relation to him. The distance between Ares and the rest of Olympus is not a problem being solved. It is a stable condition, a description of how things stand when war and its management exist in the same cosmological space. The boulder lies back on the plain of Troy after the moment has passed. The stone, a flat-topped rock, wide enough that a goddess could lift it, ordinary enough that men had found it useful for a boundary, settles back into the earth with whatever weight it carried before the story required it. It is not a remarkable object. It was not remarkable before Athena picked it up, and it is not remarkable after she sets it down. What happened around it was remarkable. What the stone itself is just stone, the material the Greek world was mostly made of, old and dense and patient, marking its small human line across the ground as it had been placed to do, holding its position on the plain of Troy, while everything else the war set in motion moved around it and past it, and finally away. The plain of Troy, in Homer's telling of it, is a place defined above all by its noise. Bronze on bronze, horses breathing hard, the earth itself described as groaning under the weight of men fighting across it, dust rising in thick columns toward a sky that the gods regard from above, the way a person might observe, from a great height, a disturbance on a body of water. Into this particular kind of chaos, on a particular day in the long 10th year of the war, Ares arrived in the way that Ares always arrived, not because a cause had called to him, not because principle or loyalty had drawn him to one side or the other, but because the fighting was already there, enormous and loud, and full of exactly the quality of destruction that his nature required. Homer is careful about this distinction in the way that a narrator is careful about something that matters to the meaning of the story. Other gods in the Iliad arrive at Troy with declared interests. Hera wants the Greeks to win and pursues that outcome with the patient, strategic attention of someone who has been planning a long time. Athena wants the Greeks to win and brings to her support the tactical intelligence of a general working through a campaign. Apollo protects the Trojans for reasons rooted in ancient compact and in what the tradition understands as his domain, order, prophecy, the particular sanctity of a city that has honored him. These are allegiances that belong to something. Arphes' presence on the Trojan side carries no equivalent weight. It belongs in Homer's framing to the same logic that brings a storm to the sea, not because the sea has done anything to deserve it, but because a storm, arriving, finds the sea there. This is how the Iliad understands the distinction between a god who carries war as part of their portfolio and a god who is war in its least reasoned form. Athena fights in the Iliad. She carries a spear. She stands at the shoulders of Greek heroes and redirects what they throw. But Athena fighting is always Athena thinking, which is to say that even in the moment of violence, she is doing something that belongs to the broader intelligence she embodies. Ares on the Trojan plain is something else, a force that the narrative treats, even in its quieter moments, as a kind of weather, present, impersonal, indifferent to everything except the continuation of the thing it already is. The Trojan plain in the 5th book of the Iliad is described with a specificity that has the texture of observation rather than invention. Dust on the flats, the particular bronze and sweat smell of armies that have been fighting long enough for exhaustion to become its own separate condition. Chariots turning, men who have been alive in the morning and are not alive by the afternoon. And through all of this, Ares moves in the way that a god moves, when their nature and the scene around them are the same thing, without friction, without effort, drawn toward the heaviest concentration of killing, the way a current in a river is drawn toward the lowest ground. He is not managing the battle. He is not directing it toward any particular conclusion. He is, in some sense, that Homer understands and keeps returning to, simply the part of the battle that cannot be reduced to anything more tractable. The Greeks who heard this poem understood the distinction it was making. Ares was real to them in the way that the irrational element of any catastrophe is real, recognizable, recurring, impossible to reason with. An army in formation, commanded by experienced generals, fighting for a defined objective, was closer to Athena's domain. The same army en route, its lines broken, men running without direction, killing anything they reached, that was the condition Ares presided over. His presence at Troy on the Trojan side was not, in the mythological logic of the poem, a statement about the justice of the Trojan cause. It was simply a description of what war, at its most unmediated, looks like when the gods decide to personify it and give it a place in a story. On this particular day, the fifth book, the Olympians had made an unusual arrangement. They had agreed, or been compelled by Zeus to agree, to withdraw from the battlefield and let the mortals fight without divine interference. Most of the gods accepted this. Ares did not stay away, or rather, the poem's logic does not allow for Ares to stay away, because Ares staying away from a battle of this scale is a statement the myth is not capable of making about his nature. He was there. He was always going to be there. The only question the poem is interested in is what would happen when, on this day, a mortal was given the specific capacity to reach him. That mortal was Diomedes, son of Tydeus, king of Argos, and the fifth book of the Iliad is in many respects his book. Athena had taken an interest in Diomedes that went beyond her general interest in the Greek cause. She had given him something, a particular quality of perception, a brightness that the poem describes as a kind of fire burning from his helmet and his shield, a capacity for seeing things on the battlefield that ordinary human sight does not reach. Among the things that this enhanced vision gave him was the ability to perceive the gods moving through the battle. He could see which figures were divine, and in the arrangement Athena had made with him, he was permitted to act on what he saw. With one exception, he was told to withdraw from Aphrodite. Diomedes moved through the battle on that day with the methodical focus of someone who has been given a very clear task and is working through it. There is something almost functional in Homer's description of him, a warrior doing what he has been enabled to do with a consistency that belongs less to heroic narrative and more to the quiet competence of a craftsman at work. He moved through Trojans. He encountered gods who had entered the fighting and did not withdraw from them. He wounded Aphrodite when she came to the aid of her son Aeneas, a moment that shocked the divine assembly for reasons that had nothing to do with Ares. And then, at some point in the long afternoon of the battle, Athena found her way back to Diomedes' side. What Athena did at this moment is described in the Iliad with a particular economy that carries its own kind of weight. She had been watching Ares on the plain. She had been watching the god of war moving through the fighting in the way that she, of all the Olympians, was most qualified to understand, not as a divine peer engaged in principled combat, but as a force disrupting the shape of a battle that, left to human agency, might have moved toward a different outcome. She stepped into Diomedes' chariot. She took the reins from his driver Sthenelus, who moved to make way for her without apparent argument. And then she did something that is described in the poem as a single deliberate act. She guided the chariot toward Ares. The god of war, in this moment, was engaged. He had just taken the life of a Greek warrior named Periphas, a son of Ochesius, and he was standing over the body in the way that warriors in the Iliad stand over the dead, in the fullness of the act, present to what has just been completed. He had a spear raised. He was, by every measure of the battlefield, a figure in the ascendant. What he could not see, or what the poem allows him to miss, was Athena standing in the chariot beside Diomedes, pulling the divine concealment of her helmet around herself so that Ares could not perceive her presence there. Diomedes threw the spear. Athena guided it. Those two facts coexist in the Iliad without apparent contradiction. It was Diomedes' throw, and it was Athena's redirection, and the poem allows both things to be true without explaining how a human arm can send bronze in a direction a goddess adjusts. This is not a narrative inconsistency in Homer, but a statement about how divine presence operates in the poem's logic. Athena did not throw the spear. She was not the one fighting Ares, but she made sure the spear went where she had decided it should go. The difference is one that the Iliad cares about, the distinction between divine action and divinely enabled mortal action, the thing a god does for a human and the thing a human does that a god has made possible. The spear drove into the lower part of Ares's body, into the flesh at his belt, and the god was wounded. What follows in Homer is one of the most remarkable passages in the Iliad for the specific quality of its strangeness. A god has been wounded by a mortal's weapon. The poem does not treat this as the climax it might seem to be from the outside. It does not pause for the kind of ceremonial weight a modern narrative might give to the moment a divine figure is diminished. What it gives instead is a sound. Homer describes the cry of Ares when the spear strikes him as being like the shouting of 9,000 men, or 10,000, or a number in that register of scale. The Greek varies slightly across manuscript traditions, but the sense is consistent, a sound larger than any human voice, larger than any individual moment of pain, a sound that is the sound of war itself, registering that its embodiment has been touched by something it did not anticipate. The Greek warriors and the Trojans on the plain below hear this sound, and they feel it in the way that a sudden change in the atmosphere of a place is felt not as a specific noise with a specific source, but as a change in the quality of the air around them, a shift in what the afternoon feels like. The sound described that way does something to the scene around it. It makes Ares's pain strangely impersonal. The cry of 10,000 men is not the cry of any one man. It is not intimate. It does not invite the kind of sympathy that a single voice in distress invites. It is too large for that. And perhaps this is part of what Homer is reaching for with the comparison. Not a diminishment of divine suffering exactly, but a description of what it looks like when a force rather than a person is hurt, when the thing that bleeds is less like a being in pain and more like a weather system registering that something has passed through it. After the sound, Ares left. This is the fact that the fifth book comes to, and it comes to it with the same directness that Homer applies to most of the events of the Iliad. The god of war was on the plain of Troy, engaged in the fighting, present in the full sense that his nature requires, and then he was not. He rose from the battlefield. He went up through the air toward Olympus, moving away from the dust and the noise and the particular morning into afternoon light of the Trojan plain, leaving behind the battle that was in some sense the only place he had ever truly been. The image of that departure is worth holding for a moment, because it recurs in various forms across the traditions that describe Ares, and what it has in common in each version is a specific quality of withdrawal rather than retreat. This was not a tactical withdrawal. There was no strategy in it, no calculation about regrouping and returning. Ares left the way a force dissipates, not because it has been defeated in any meaningful sense, but because the condition that sustained it has changed and it can no longer maintain the same form. The spear did not defeat Ares, it made him unable in this moment to continue doing what he does. The distinction between those two things is one that the myth preserves carefully. On Olympus, Ares presented himself before Zeus. The scene that follows is one of the scenes in the Iliad that had already been registered in the context of what Zeus says about his son and what it means, the direct, unapologetic statement of a god telling his own child that he is the most detestable among the Olympians, that if he were not Zeus's own flesh, he would have been consigned to Tartarus long before. These words are not new when Ares arrives wounded. They have the quality of something being restated rather than newly said, as though this is a verdict that has been standing for some time. And Ares's arrival with a wound has simply provided another occasion to confirm it. The court on Olympus receives this wounded god the way it receives most things. Ares does, with the settled quiet of people who have already formed their opinion and are not surprised to find it confirmed again. The poem does not describe the other Olympians responding with sympathy. It does not describe them responding with satisfaction either, which might have given the scene the wrong kind of heat. What it describes is closer to the flat equilibrium of a room where the same thing has happened before and will happen again, and everyone present knows this about the room and about the person standing in it. Zeus did send for Paeon, the divine physician, to heal the wound. This is the other half of the scene that the rebuke tends to overshadow, the fact that even after the declaration of detestability, even after the explicit statement that Ares does not deserve pity, Zeus arranged for the wound to be closed. Paeon spread his medicines and the flesh healed, the way divine flesh heals in the Iliad, quickly and completely, in a way that mortal flesh does not. Ares was restored, and then the poem moves on, because Ares restored is not a different condition from Ares before the wound. He is the same force he was, returned to himself, and the story has no further comment to make about what that means. The healing is its own kind of comment, though. It says something about the nature of the Olympian assembly and about what Zeus's relationship to Ares actually is, beneath the language of detestability. The 12 Olympians could not unmake each other. The divine court on the mountain was not a meritocracy in which the most valued members were kept and the least valuable expelled. Ares occupied a seat because war itself could not be removed from the world. And the tradition was honest enough about this to build it into the structure of the pantheon. The god who was not celebrated, not admired, not trusted by anyone, including his own father, held his place not because he had earned it, but because what he represented was a permanent feature of the world the gods administered. Zeus healing the wound after declaring it undeserved is exactly this logic expressed in a single gesture. Above the Trojan plain, on that same day, the sons of Ares were there. This is one of the details that Homer gives the tradition without elaborating on it. Phobos and Deimos, whose names the Greeks translated without ceremony as fear and dread, appearing in the Iliad as the figures who harness Ares's horses before battle and ride alongside him into the fighting. They are not characters in any extended narrative sense. The poem does not give them speeches. It does not describe their actions on the plain with the same specificity it gives to the actions of divine figures like Athena or Apollo. What it does is name them, and in naming them as the sons of the war god, give the tradition a way of accounting for the psychological experience of being in the presence of what their father embodies. Fear and dread are not the same thing, and the distinction is one that survives in the names across 2,500 years of usage. Phobos is the acute response, the sudden contraction, the moment the body understands before the mind does, the thing that happens when a person realizes, all at once, that something dangerous has entered the space they are standing in. Didymus is the longer condition, the state of apprehension that settles into a body before the danger arrives, the particular quality of dread that belongs to waiting and to knowing what is coming and being unable to stop it. Both are experiences of war. Both are as real and as inescapable as the fighting itself. And by making them divine sons who ride beside their father into battle, the tradition was doing something interesting, not just naming feelings, but giving them a genealogy, a divine origin, a place in the order of things that the gods themselves have arranged. The image of Phobos and Deimos working at the horses is one that repays a particular kind of attention. The Iliad places them at the task of harnessing, a practical, physical, preparatory act, the kind of thing that happens before the battle, rather than in it. Buckles being fastened, the traces adjusted, the animals standing in the early light of a military day, warm in the way horses are warm, breathing the particular steady breath of animals who do not know yet that the day is going to be the kind of day it is going to be. Two divine figures, whose names are the names of experiences rather than persons, are performing this task with the focused attention of people who have done it before and will do it again, and who are not, in this moment, anything other than what they appear to be. Attendants preparing their father's horses for the road ahead. There is something worth pausing on in how the tradition handles the question of divine children as personified qualities. Phobos and Deimos were not born as metaphors and then assigned to Ares to explain something about his nature. They were, in the Greek mythological understanding, genuine divine beings, presences in the world who had their own reality, who could be invoked and propitiated, and who were understood to have actual agency in what happened to humans who encountered the conditions they represented. Soldiers before battle would have known what it was to feel both of them in the body simultaneously. The names gave that knowledge a structure, a way of saying this is a real thing, it has a nature, it belongs to something larger than my own fear, it is as old as the war god himself, and it comes from the same source. The horses being harnessed are the horses of Ares. The chariot is the chariot of war. And the two figures working quietly at the straps and traces carry in their names the full description of what a body feels when it understands where the chariot is going. Homer's Iliad was likely composed in something approaching its surviving form during the 8th century BCE, though the tradition holds that it draws on material substantially older, oral poetry circulating in the Mycenaean world, stories of a war at Troy, or at something that Troy stood for, carried through generations of singers who modified and preserved and extended them according to the demands of their audiences and their own understanding of the tradition. Ares in the Iliad is almost certainly not a new figure invented for the poem. The war god was present in the Greek religious imagination well before Homer gave him the specific scenes of the 5th book, the wound, the cry, the departure, the rebuke on Olympus. What the Iliad does with that inherited figure is formalize something about him that the tradition had perhaps been saying in various ways for a long time. It creates, in the scenes of Book 5, a structural demonstration performed in front of an audience who knew what the figures involved represented, that a particular kind of war is subordinate to a particular kind of intelligence. Ares on the plain of Troy is war in its most elemental form. He is the force that arrives without strategy, fights without loyalty, causes damage because causing damage is what he is. Athena in Diomedes' chariot is the thing the Greeks understood as the corrective to that force, not the absence of war, but war with direction, with purpose, with the capacity to distinguish between the situation that requires violence and the situation that does not. The boulder that enters the tradition in Book 21 is a different scene and a later development in the poem's handling of this theme, but the logic it expresses is already present in Book 5, in everything that Athena does beside Diomedes. That afternoon, the spear she guides is not her spear. The victory is not formally hers, but the outcome belongs to her in every meaningful sense. The choice of target, the adjustment of the throw, the decision that Ares's presence on the plain had run long enough for one day. This is how the poem understands the relationship between the two kinds of war the two gods represent. Not that intelligence defeats violence in any final sense, but that in the specific moment of encounter, intelligence directs the violence more precisely than violence can direct itself. The wound closed. The rebuke was delivered. The battlefield at Troy continued its work without the god of war in it for the remainder of that day's fighting, and Homer's poem moved forward toward the morning and the long book of the wall assault and the night of Agamemnon's difficult sleep that follow it. The plain absorbed what it always absorbed. The dust settled in the late afternoon in the particular way that dust settles when the fighting has eased, slowly, not all at once, as though the air itself is taking time to remember what stillness feels like. On Olympus, the horses stood in whatever stable or divine equivalent the mountain held for them. The harnesses from the morning had been removed, or would be removed, when Phobos and Deimos returned from wherever the battle had taken them. The sons of the war god, completing the same task in reverse, unbuckling what they had buckled, easing the traces from the animals who had carried their father to the plain, and now stood in the quiet of the evening, with no further obligation for the day. In the Greek mythological imagination, these routines mattered. The gods were not only the large moments, the wound, the cry, the rebuke before the assembly. They were also the preparations, the returns, the ordinary domestic details of the divine household that the tradition occasionally allowed to surface in its poems and hymns and the commentary of ancient writers who had spent long years with the material. Phobos and Deimos harness the horses. This is the detail the Iliad gives, and the detail in its quietness contains something about how the Greeks thought about the feelings these divine figures personified. Fear does not arrive without preparation. Dread is not formless. Both are present before the battle begins, already there in the early light, already involved in the practical work of getting the horses ready, already part of the day before the day has become what it will become. They are not consequences of the fighting, they are attendants of it. They arrive when their father arrives, and they work alongside him with the quiet competence of presences, who have been doing this for as long as war has been a feature of the world, which in the Greek understanding was as long as the world has been a world at all. The plain of Troy lay beneath the mountain in Homer's imagination, the way plains always lie beneath mountains, a long way down, visible from above in a certain way of looking, the ships on the beach and the walls of the city and the trampled ground between them, resolving, at sufficient distance, into something that looks almost ordered, a story being told from enough of a remove that its lines are visible. The gods watched it from that remove. Ares, when he was healed, would return to it eventually, not because anything had changed, not because the rebuke had altered something in his nature, but because this was where his nature required him to be, and the Trojan War still had years of fighting ahead of it, and the plain was still there, still loud, still full of everything that drew him. The horses of the war god waited in whatever stillness the mountain offered them, their breath the steady, unhurried breath of animals resting. Two sons of the god of war worked quietly in the dark of the stable, their names carrying between them the complete description of what a body in the presence of violence knows before any other knowledge arrives. Phobos, the thing that contracts, sharp, immediate, already over by the time it has been named. Deimos, the longer settling, the state that inhabits the bones and stays there, patient, particular, waiting with the same patient quality that it always waits with, as old as anything the tradition knows. The buckles in their hands, the breath of the horses against the cool of the evening, the Trojan plain far below, settling into its own kind of quiet as the day moved toward dark, the sounds of the afternoon's fighting giving way to the specific silence that a battlefield holds at night, not peaceful exactly, not the silence of a place where nothing is happening, but a waiting silence, the silence of a pause rather than an ending, everything in it already preparing for the morning that would come and the noise that morning would bring with it. The horses stood. The sons of Ares continued their work. The night around the mountain was wide and still, and below it the world they attended went on being the world they attended, ancient, ordinary, full of the specific feelings their names described, as it had always been and would continue to be long after any individual battle on the plain of Troy had ended and been absorbed into everything that followed it. In the hall of the Phaeacians, the fire had been burning for some time. The guests were settled. The wine had moved around the tables, and the particular quality of attention in the room had shifted from the restless kind to the patient kind, the kind that comes when an evening has found its shape, and everyone present has agreed, without saying so, to remain inside it a little longer. Aeneas, king of the Phaeacians, had called for his bard. The bard's name was Demodocus, and Demodocus, as Homer tells it in the 8th book of the Odyssey, began to sing. The song he chose was not solemn. It was not the kind of song that required the room to sit very still and feel the weight of large events. It was the kind of song that people ask for when the food is finished and the lamps are burning low, and what is wanted is not instruction, but entertainment, the comfortable pleasure of hearing a story whose shape is already known, whose ending has been known for generations, whose particular satisfactions arrive exactly where everyone in the room expects them to arrive. Demodocus sang about Ares and Aphrodite. He sang about a war god and a love goddess, and the thing that a craftsman built to catch them both, and the room, Homer says, was very pleased. The Greek tradition held this story with a kind of warm, communal familiarity. It was not a sacred myth in the sense that the creation of the cosmos was sacred, or that the founding of cities was sacred. It was something closer to a well-loved tale, the kind that circulates through a culture because it contains something permanently entertaining, permanently true, in the specific way that good stories are true, which is not the same as being factually accurate, but is also not entirely different from it. That Demodocus performs it at a feast for an audience of well-fed and comfortable people is itself a detail worth sitting with. Homer is telling the reader something about what kind of story this is and what kind of pleasure it was designed to give. It is a story for the end of the evening, a story for the fire dying low. What Demodocus sings is this: Ares and Aphrodite had been conducting an affair in secret, or at least in what they believed was secret, which is a different thing and a distinction the story turns on entirely. Aphrodite was married to Hephaestus, the god of the forge, whose domain was fire and metal and the extraordinary things that could be made when a patient intelligence was applied to both. Hephaestus was not the kind of Olympian the other gods spoke about with easy admiration in matters of beauty or grace. He was associated with labor, with the heat and grime of the forge, with the slow, deliberate work of making things that had not existed before. And Aphrodite, whose domain was love and its attendant radiances, had apparently decided that the proximity to Ares, war itself in its most elemental form, was preferable to whatever the forge god offered. The affair between them had been proceeding for some time by the moment the song opens. That detail is implied rather than stated, but it is there in the way the story is arranged. The sense that what is about to happen has been made possible by a long prior history of meetings that no one caught. In Greek mythology, the realm of what is hidden is never quite as hidden as the parties involved believe it to be. The sky above, the particular apparatus of divine observation, the fact that the cosmos contains watchers whose role is exactly this, to move across the sky and see what the day contains, all of it conspires against the private. What happens in the world below is visible to someone. It is almost always visible to someone. That someone in this story was Helios. Helios was the god of the sun, whose daily work was the arc he made across the sky, from east to west, rising in the morning, traversing the dome of the world in his chariot, descending in the evening, and beginning again. It was not a role that required interpretation or strategy. It required presence, consistency, the patient repetition of the same passage, made at the same height, across the same sky, day after day, without variation. And the consequence of that particular role, a consequence that the story presents as entirely natural, entirely unintended, was that Helios saw everything, not because he sought to observe, not because he was curious about the affairs of other gods, but because the arc he followed took him directly above every corner of the world below, and the world below was lit by the light he carried, and what the light falls on, the light reveals. On some particular morning, in the ordinary course of his route, Helios looked down and saw what Ares and Aphrodite were doing. The story does not specify exactly what he saw. It does not need to. The detail the story cares about is not the content of what was observed, but the fact of its observation, and the chain of consequences that observation set moving. What Helios did with what he saw was to go directly to Hephaestus and tell him, no deliberation, no hesitation, no consideration of whether it was his business to deliver this particular piece of information. The sun had witnessed something it was not meant to witness. The sun reported it. The sun continued on its path. Hephaestus received this information with a kind of controlled inward response that the story describes without dwelling on. What Homer gives the forge god is not a long scene of grief or rage. What Homer gives him is a decision, arrived at almost immediately, to respond to the betrayal with the specific tool available to him, which was not physical force, not divine authority, not any of the weapons a war god might reach for, but craft, skill, the patient application of an extraordinary intelligence to the question of what precisely needed to be made, and how fine it needed to be, and what effect it would have when the right moment arrived. He went to his forge. That is where the story goes next, and it is worth pausing inside that image for a moment. The forge of Hephaestus was his particular place in the mythology, the location where his specific genius expressed itself, where the heat and the metal and the slow accumulation of precise work produced things that no other Olympian could produce. He had made the palaces of the gods. He had made the armor of Achilles, described in such extraordinary detail in the Iliad that the description of it takes up most of a single book. He had made the bronze automata, the self-moving servants of gold, who walked and worked in his workshop with something approaching life. He was, in the Greek imagination, the figure who demonstrated what could be made when a mind that understood materials was given enough time and sufficient fire. What he made now was a net, but the word net suggests something coarser than what the story describes. What Hephaestus fashioned in his forge, in response to the information Helios had brought him, was a structure of bronze so fine that it was nearly impossible to see, not because it was small, but because the individual strands of which it was composed had been worked down to a thinness that the metal had no right to achieve. Bronze, which is heavy and dense and not inclined toward delicacy, drawn out under his hands until it became something closer to a web than a chain, something that caught the light in the way that dew-covered filaments catch the light in the early morning, there and almost not there at the same time. The tradition describes it as unbreakable despite its fineness. The two qualities are presented together without apology. The net was both nearly invisible and stronger than any force that might be applied against it, because these were simply the properties of a thing made by Hephaestus, when he had a specific purpose in mind and the patience to pursue it. He hung this net above the bed. Again, the story does not linger on the mechanics, because the mechanics are not the point. The point is the arrangement, the preparation made by a craftsman who understood that the way to catch something was not to pursue it directly, but to wait and to make the waiting look like nothing. The room around the net was ordinary. The bed was as it always appeared. The air in the room held no sign of what had been added to it, because what had been added to it was functionally invisible. A structure of bronze threads hanging above a piece of furniture in a quiet room, ready to fall, time to fall, arranged by a patient and deeply wronged intelligence to fall at exactly the right moment. Then Hephaestus pretended to leave. He announced to those around him that he was departing for Lemnos, the island associated with his cult, the place that was in some versions of his story, the location of his forge, the place he could plausibly be expected to go. He made his departure visible. He wanted it known that he had gone. The story does not require us to think too hard about whether other gods suspected anything, because the story does not care about the gap in the plan. It cares about the result. Ares, observing that Hephaestus had left, did what Ares did. He came to the house. He went to the room. He did not look up. The net fell. Homer does not describe this moment as violent or spectacular. The net fell, and then the two gods were held inside it, caught against the bed, unable to move, unable to break the bronze strands that the forge had made too fine to snap and too strong to pull apart. Aphrodite could not rise. Ares, who was a war god and whose body was filled with whatever substance gave him his extraordinary capacity for force on a battlefield, found that the capacity for force was not useful against a mesh of this particular kind. The more a trapped thing pulls against a well-made net, the more thoroughly it is held. This is the nature of nets, and Hephaestus understood it, and he had made this one well. What Hephaestus did next says something about the specific quality of mind the story gives him. He did not simply free the couple and receive an apology. He did not settle the matter privately. He came back. The departure for Lemnos had been brief. The return was immediate, and when he arrived and confirmed what the net contained, he summoned the other male gods of Olympus to come and witness what he had found. This is presented in Homer as entirely deliberate. The humiliation was not a side effect of what Hephaestus had arranged. The humiliation was part of the arrangement. The net was the mechanism. The audience was the conclusion. The gods came. The goddesses, Homer notes with a detail that has interested readers for a long time, stayed away, a note of modesty on their behalf that the story records without comment and moves past quickly. The gods who arrived were Poseidon, Apollo, Hermes, and the others, the male Olympians, gathering to see what had been caught in the forge god's net. And what they found, when they arrived and looked at the bed and the thing above it, was the god of war and the goddess of love, held together inside a web of bronze, so fine it was almost not there, unable to move, unable to pretend the situation was other than what it was. Homer says the gods laughed. The word he uses carries the sense of a shared communal response, not the private amusement of an individual, but the collective recognition of an audience at a moment in a performance they have all been waiting for. The laughter is not described as cruel. It does not seem in the telling to be aimed at causing pain. It is more the laughter of people who have just watched a story arrive at exactly the ending. The story was always moving toward the kind of satisfaction that comes when all the pieces of a situation resolve into the shape they were always going to resolve into, and the room simply acknowledges it together. Among the gods gathered to observe, there was a conversation. Apollo turned to Hermes and asked him a question that Homer records in detail, and which has been one of the most quoted passages of this story in subsequent centuries. The question was whether Hermes, caught in such a position, trapped in a net beside the most beautiful of the goddesses, the object of every divine attention and desire, would consider it a burden or a pleasure. Hermes's answer was immediate and unambiguous. He said that he would not mind it at all. He said that 3 times as many nets, and every god on Olympus watching, and the goddess Artemis watching too, and every other divine watcher that could be assembled, none of it would change his answer. Hermes said this. The gods laughed again. This exchange is worth sitting with for a moment because it does something subtle. In the middle of a scene whose nominal purpose is the exposure and humiliation of Ares, Homer interrupts the business of the story to let 2 other gods have a conversation that is entirely its own small thing, quick, wry, light, the banter of figures who are taking a great deal of pleasure in being where they are and seeing what they are seeing. It is a moment of warmth inside the machinery of the myth, a reminder that the story is being told for people who enjoy it, by a poet who also enjoys it, in a tradition that understood laughter as one of the legitimate registers of divine activity. The gods were not always solemn. The myths were not always grave. Sometimes the register was this. Poseidon's role in the story arrives after the laughter, where the other gods were primarily spectators, their function in the scene to constitute the audience that makes the public nature of the humiliation complete. Poseidon was the one who moved the situation toward resolution. He was the god of the sea, whose domain was one of the most fundamental forces in the Greek world, and he carried with him a kind of authority that sat beside Zeus's without quite competing with it. He went to Hephaestus, and he urged the forge god to release the 2 caught gods. He offered something in exchange. He offered to guarantee personally that Ares would pay whatever restitution was owed, that the situation would be settled through the proper social and legal mechanisms that the tradition understood as the appropriate response to this kind of transgression. Hephaestus was reluctant. Homer gives him a moment of genuine resistance, the protest of a wronged party who is not yet finished being wronged, who recognizes that releasing the captives ends the scene he has constructed and returns the situation to a negotiation in which he has less control. He asked Poseidon directly what would happen if Ares, once released, simply declined to pay. He was asking, in the form that a craftsman might ask a legal question about the reliability of the guarantee being offered. Poseidon's answer was straightforward. He said he would see to it himself. The weight of his particular divine standing was offered as surety. If Ares did not pay what was owed, Poseidon would. Hephaestus released them. The bronze net was removed from above the bed. Ares, freed, left immediately. The tradition says he went to Thrace, the region the Greeks associated with cold and hardship and the particular roughness of the world at its northern edges, which was also the region most closely associated with his worship. Aphrodite went to Cyprus, the island that was most particularly hers, and there the older traditions hold the sea and the air, and the warmth of her own domain restored whatever the scene in the net had taken from her. The affair continued afterward, in some versions of the tradition. Others leave that detail unspecified. The story was not primarily interested in whether the affair persisted. The story was interested in the net, and the laughter, and the guarantee, and the particular quality of wit that a craftsman could deploy against a war god when he put his mind to it. The social machinery that Poseidon's intervention describes is worth noticing. The tradition did not resolve this situation through ongoing punishment, through a curse, through a divine sentence of permanent consequence. It resolved it through a process that looks, from a certain angle, surprisingly ordinary, a guarantee offered, a debt acknowledged, terms to be settled in the proper way. The myth operated within a framework of social and legal expectation that the Greeks recognized from their own world, applied upward to the divine. Even gods, in this tradition, were subject to the expectation that wrongs would be answered through restitution rather than through endless recrimination. The net catches them, the laughter witnesses it, the guarantee settles it. The morning after, the world continues. This is one of the things the story was doing beneath its entertainment. The Greek tradition understood Hephaestus as a figure whose power was precisely not the obvious kind. He was not a god of the battlefield. He was not a god of the sky or the sea. He was the god of the forge, of fire and patience, and the slow transformation of raw material into made things. His defeat of Ares was not a defeat in any military sense. It was a demonstration of a different kind of competence. What the story shows is that the war god, for all his capacity for violence on a battlefield, was not equipped to anticipate or respond to an intelligence of this particular kind. Ares knew how to fight. He did not know how to look up. The story in Homer's Odyssey is the fullest version of this myth that survives, but the myth itself was clearly older and more widely distributed than any single telling of it. Demodocus sings it at a feast, which means it was already a known entertainment by the time Homer placed it in that context. The audience in the hall at Alcinous's court is described as pleased by it, pleased in the way that people are pleased by a song they have heard before and want to hear again, not pleased in the way that people are pleased by a piece of news. This is significant. The story was not by Homer's time revealing anything new. It was redelivering something that had already been absorbed into the shared imaginative life of the culture, available to be enjoyed in the way that any very good thing can be enjoyed more than once. The particular comedy of the scene has survived across the entire subsequent history of the tradition's reception. Later Greek writers returned to it. Roman poets worked with it. The image of the god of war caught in an invisible net, publicly humiliated in front of his divine peers, and then set loose to go to Thrace, while the other gods dispersed, still laughing. This image proved durable, not because it contained a hidden moral lesson that required decoding, not because it was secretly a philosophical allegory, though ancient commentators found those too, but because it was, on the surface of it genuinely entertaining, a powerful figure reduced by a clever device. The audience positioned to see something the principals cannot see. The satisfaction of wit prevailing over force. These satisfactions are old, and they work on people the way old satisfactions do, which is reliably and without needing to explain themselves. It is worth spending a moment with the craftsmanship of the net itself, not as a plot device, but as an object. What Hephaestus made, as the tradition describes it, was something that occupied a paradoxical category. It was bronze, which is heavy and strong and associated with war, the material from which weapons and armor were made, the material of the Trojan War's shields and spears. And yet he worked it into something fine enough to be nearly invisible, strong enough to hold a war god, and delicate enough to fall without a sound. The object itself is a kind of argument. It is the forge god asserting, in material form, that the same substance used to make instruments of war can be made into something else entirely, if the right hands apply themselves to it with sufficient patience. The trap is made of what the trapped god most represents. There is something satisfying about that, in the way that a well-constructed sentence is satisfying, the pleasure of the parts fitting together in a way that feels both inevitable and surprising. The net, once its work was done, would have been removed from the bed and returned somewhere to the forge, perhaps, or set aside in whatever location a god kept the things he had made for a specific purpose and no longer needed in active use. It did not remain suspended above the bed. The situation it was built to address had resolved itself, and the object designed for that situation had served its function completely. What the tradition leaves behind is not the net as an ongoing presence in the myth, but the net as a remembered action, the thing Hephaestus did, the way he did it, the quality of mind that the doing demonstrated. The net disappears from the story. The impression of it stays. The scene in that bed, with the net above it, and the gods assembled around it, and Hermes laughing, and Poseidon negotiating, and the war god held still, inside a thing he did not know was there. This is the scene that Greek culture filed away under the category of entertaining truths, not the kind of truth that changes behavior, not the kind of truth that reforms or instructs, the kind of truth that confirms something a person already suspected, gives it a form, and allows it to be shared. The suspected thing, in this case, was something about the relative value of cleverness and strength. The tradition did not need to spell it out. The image of Ares in the net spelled it out for it. Demodocus would have finished the song eventually. The final notes of it would have settled into the hall at Alcinous's court, and the listeners would have sat with it for a moment in the way that people sit with a song they have enjoyed before the evening moved to whatever it moved to next. Odysseus was in that hall. The story does not say whether he laughed, though he was a man who appreciated this particular kind of intelligence, the trap laid with patience, the preparation made to look like absence, the enemy caught not by force, but by being outthought. He would have known what the song was about. The hall at Alcinous's court continued on its evening. The fire in it burned down at the pace fires burn. The wine was passed and the conversations resumed, and the bard set down whatever instrument he had used, and the night moved on in the way that nights and halls move on, gradually, without announcement, toward the point where the lamps are low, and the guests are still, and the pleasure of the evening has deposited itself somewhere quiet, inside everyone present. And in the forge, wherever the tradition placed the forge of Hephaestus, whether on Lemnos, or on Olympus, or in the volcanic heart of whatever mountain his fire was said to burn beneath, the tools that had made the net were still there. The hammer that had thinned the bronze to its extraordinary delicacy, the anvil on which each strand had been worked, The fire that had made the metal soft enough to be shaped and then been allowed to cool. All of it still present, still arranged in the way that a craftsman arranges his tools when the work is done and the workshop is quiet. Not put away exactly, not abandoned, simply at rest, holding in their arrangement the record of what they had been used to make. The net that had caught a war god had been made here, with these hands, at this fire, in this particular and patient way. The forge held that fact the way stone holds heat, gradually releasing it into the surrounding air, for a long time after the fire itself has gone out. What Hephaestus demonstrated in this myth, in the specific terms the Greek tradition understood best, was that the kind of power that has no use for thought eventually encounters the kind of thought that has no need for power, and in that meeting, the outcome is not always what the stronger party expects. The net was not stronger than Ares. It was better suited to the purpose. That is a different thing, and the difference is the whole of what the story has to say, not as a lesson announced at the end. As a shape the story holds from the first image to the last, the arc from the sun crossing the sky and seeing what it was not meant to see, to the craftsman alone in his forge deciding what, precisely, to make of that information. The bronze of the net worked to its final, extraordinary thinness, still carrying in each thread the accumulated patience of the hands that drew it out, remained what it had always been, not spectacular, not heavy with significance in the way that weapons are, simply a piece of craft, completed, its purpose fulfilled, its particular fineness still present in the texture of its making. The forge held it quietly, the way forges hold the memory of everything they have been used to make. Still, in the cooling air, in the absence of the fire that had made it possible, the thing that had been made persisted, each thread of bronze as fine as it had ever been, as strong as it had ever been, the net entire and complete and lying somewhere in the dark of the forge, needing nothing further, requiring no continuation, the work already done, the craft already in it, the patience already there, inside each strand, exactly as it had been placed. Asaph Hall was at his telescope in August of 1877 in the long white building of the United States Naval Observatory in Washington, when something small and dark resolved itself out of the space around Mars. The night was clear. The instrument was the largest refractor in the world at that time, its lens 26 inches across, and Hall had been searching for several nights running, working the same methodical arc through the sky that the work required. What he found over 2 successive nights were 2 small moons, irregular in shape, dark in surface, orbiting the red planet at distances so close that earlier astronomers had simply missed them in the planet's own glare. He named them Phobos and Deimos, fear and dread. The names had been waiting in a Greek poem for more than 2,500 years. Hesiod had placed those names in the world first, in the same careful, catalog-minded poetry that listed the children of gods and assigned each one a place in the order of divine things. Phobos and Deimos were sons of Ares, the god the Romans would later call Mars, and in Hesiod's account, they attended their father the way battle attends war, inseparable from it, present wherever it went, functions given faces and names. The tradition held that they rode with Ares into battle, that they harnessed his horses and moved beside his chariot through the dust of whatever plain the fighting had reached that day. They were not independent figures with their own stories. They were, in the mythological imagination of the Greeks, something closer to what their names described, the specific feelings a battlefield produces in the body, the fear that arrives before the fighting, and the dread that settles in after. wearing the form of divine sons, so that the tradition could say something true about what war actually does to the people who survive it. That Hall reached back to those names in 1877 was not unusual. The convention of naming astronomical bodies after figures from classical mythology was already well established by then, and the connection between Mars and Ares made the naming feel obvious, even inevitable. What stays with the mind is the distance between the two moments. A Greek poet in the 7th century before the Common Era, setting down the names of a war god's sons in a list of divine inheritances, and an astronomer 2.5 millennia later pressing his eye to cold glass in an August night and finding two dark irregular shapes orbiting the planet that had always carried the war god's name. The names moved through all that time unchanged, carrying with them the particular understanding of war that the Greeks had encoded in them, that fear and dread are not incidental to battle, but native to it, that they belong to it the way children belong to a parent, inseparable and inherited. Phobos is the inner moon. It orbits Mars so close to the planet's surface that it completes its circuit in less than 8 hours, which means it circles Mars 3 full times in a single Martian day. From the surface of Mars, if something were standing there to watch, Phobos would appear to rise in the west and set in the east, moving against the sky in the wrong direction, finishing its arc before the longer Martian day had run its course. Deimos orbits farther out and more slowly. Both moons are small enough that their own gravity cannot pull them into spheres. They are lumpy and pocked, shaped more like potatoes than planets, their surfaces cratered and dark. They are not what anyone looking for moons would expect to find. And yet there they are, still circling, still carrying the names of feelings that a Greek poet decided to personify and attach to the sons of a war god who was already, within his own tradition, regarded with a kind of uneasy distance. It is worth holding that image, the small, dark, persistent moons, for a moment before moving to the larger story of what those names were attached to, and what the tradition said came out of Ares, beyond fear and dread alone, because the children of the war god were not only children of war. Ares and Aphrodite, the god of violent conflict and the goddess of love and beauty, were, in several ancient sources, the parents of figures whose natures had little to do with battle and everything to do with what the Greeks understood as the opposite of it. The tradition held that their children together included not only Phobos and Deimos, but also a daughter named Harmonia, whose very name meant accord, concord, the state of things fitting together without friction. The daughter of war and love was called Harmony. The Greeks found this worth saying. Harmonia's story moves through one of the oldest cycles in Greek mythological tradition, the founding of Thebes and the long, difficult history of the city and the family that ruled it. Cadmus was the founder, a Phoenician prince who came to Greece in search of his sister Europa after Zeus had taken her away in the form of a bull, and who eventually settled in Boeotia and built the city that would become Thebes. The tradition gave Cadmus a wife from among the gods themselves, Harmonia, daughter of Ares and Aphrodite, given to him in a wedding that ancient sources describe as one of the last occasions on which the Olympians gathered together among human beings on earth. It was a formal, celebrated event, the gods seated in one place, the marriage of a mortal king to a daughter of the divine, the old world and the new world, briefly occupying the same space. Hesiod accounts for this union. Later traditions elaborate it. The wedding was remembered as a threshold, the point after which the gods withdrew, and the long, purely human history of Greece began. What Hephaestus gave as a wedding gift to Harmonia is the detail the tradition found most worth preserving. a necklace made by the same hands that had fashioned other extraordinary things: the bronze net, the palaces of Olympus, the armor that gave its wearers advantages no ordinary smith could provide. The necklace of Harmonia was described as being of extraordinary beauty, and it was described as carrying with it a consequence that none of its wearers would fully understand until the weight of it had already moved on to someone else. Every woman who wore it encountered misfortune. The necklace passed through the queens of Thebes across generations: Jocasta, Eriphyle, others, and in each case the tradition marked what it brought with it. Not a curse exactly, not the simple punishment of a god who had decided to be cruel, but something more like the kind of consequence that travels inside a beautiful thing without announcing itself. It was a wedding gift. It was also, in the longer view of the story, a way of saying something about what happens when the children of Ares and Aphrodite move through the world. Even Harmonia herself, whose name meant the resolution of opposing forces, carried within her inheritance the traces of where she came from, and where she came from included the god of war. Cadmus had his own debt to Ares before the wedding even took place. The founding of Thebes required Cadmus to kill a great serpent, a dragon, in some accounts that guarded a spring sacred to Ares in the land where the city would be built. The tradition is specific about this. The dragon was the son, or in some versions the servant, of Ares himself, and its death created an obligation that ran between Cadmus and the war god that the marriage of their children to one another would not entirely resolve. The Greeks understood these obligations to persist. They moved through families the way the necklace moved through queens, inherited, transformed, never quite discharged. Cadmus spent years in service to Ares as part of the price the tradition assigned to that killing. The wedding to Harmonia was, among other things, the formal conclusion of that long period of consequence. The gods gathered to mark it. Then they went back to wherever gods go when they are no longer present, and Thebes was left with its long history ahead of it, and Harmonia's necklace already beginning its passage from hand to hand. Some ancient traditions gave Ares and Aphrodite a further child in Eros, the god of erotic longing, desire in its most immediate and ungovernable form. This attribution was not universal in the ancient sources, and other traditions gave Eros a different parentage, or treated him as a primordial force older than either of them. The tradition was not settled on this point, but in the versions that did trace Eros to the union of Ares and Aphrodite, there was something the ancient commentators noticed and found worth considering. That desire itself, understood this way, came from the meeting of war and love, not from love alone, from the collision of opposition and attraction, from the unstable combination of the most violent divine nature in the Olympian assembly and the goddess whose domain was beauty and pleasure and the specific power that brings people toward one another against their better judgment. Desire as the child of that meeting has a particular shape, impulsive, irrational, arriving without warning, difficult to resist, not always concerned with the well-being of its recipients. The genealogy, in other words, was a piece of cosmological thinking. The Greeks were explaining something they had noticed about how longing actually behaves, what made Ares a god that other gods kept at a distance, and the tradition is quite consistent about this, from Homer through to the later mythographers, was not simply his association with violence. Every culture that has told stories about gods has found ways to include violence within the divine order. The Greeks had Ares and kept him at arm's length for reasons that had more to do with what kind of violence he represented. The other Olympians were associated with domains that touched the life of the polis in sustaining ways. Athena was the goddess of the city itself, of its governance, its crafts, its strategic defense. Apollo moved through medicine and music and prophecy. Demeter held the grain. Poseidon held the sea that the Greeks sailed for trade and survival. Each of these domains, however dangerous at their extremes, had a constructive dimension that the city could organize itself around, could build temples for, and hold festivals to, and teach its children about as models for how to live. Ares had no constructive dimension. What he presided over, the chaos and bloodlust of combat, pursued for its own sake, without strategy or principle or civic purpose, was not something a city could build itself around. It was something a city endured and tried to survive and felt grateful to be finished with. The tradition gave this understanding its clearest expression in the moments when Ares and Athena came into direct opposition. Athena was also, among many other things, a goddess of war, but of a particular kind of war, the disciplined and purposeful kind that serves a larger strategic and civic end. The difference between them was not a difference of power so much as a difference of nature. Ares was war experienced as pure, uncalculated force. Athena was war understood as a tool of intelligent governance. The tradition made it clear, with a consistency that amounts to a position, which of those two versions of warfare the Greeks preferred and which they merely accepted as unavoidable. The stone that Athena lifted in the Iliad, a boundary marker, set in the earth by men who needed the landscape to hold a meaning, was not a weapon. It became one in her hands, used practically and efficiently, and then it was simply a stone again. The violence was instrumental. It accomplished something. It was not an end in itself. The Amazons occupied a particular position in the tradition's account of Ares's children, a whole nation rather than individual figures. Their divine ancestry used to explain something about their nature that the Greeks found otherwise difficult to place within the categories their culture had established. A warrior culture of women, skilled in battle, governing themselves without the structural organization of the Greek polis, living at the edges of the known world, in a landscape the tradition described as harsh and remote. Their descent from Ares gave their martial ability a mythological coherence. It was inherited. It was divine in origin. It placed them within the framework the tradition used to understand why certain people fought the way they fought, not because they had trained and chose it, but because the blood that ran in them made it native. The Amazons appeared in the myths of Heracles and of Theseus, in stories that brought them into contact with the Greek heroic tradition, and in each case their fighting ability was treated as formidable enough to require the tradition's greatest heroes to take seriously. Daughters of Ares. The inheritance was legible. Cycnus was a different kind of inheritance. Hesiod's Shield of Heracles, a poem attributed to Hesiod, though some later scholars have placed its composition later, gives a detailed account of a mortal son of Ares who had built himself a sanctuary of a particular kind, a temple constructed from the skulls of travelers he had killed on the road to Delphi. The tradition is specific about the location. The road to Delphi was sacred ground, the path to the oracle, the place where Greeks traveled to receive divine guidance, the most important pilgrimage route in the Greek world. Cycnus had placed himself on it and was killing the people who traveled it. Heracles encountered him, and the encounter ended with Cycnus dead. What Hesiod's poem records is what happened next. Ares, the father, arrived in fury and moved against Heracles in response to the death of his son, and Heracles wounded him, a spear that struck the god of war and sent him from the field. Zeus ended the confrontation with a thunderbolt, separating them before it could go further. Ares withdrew. The tradition noted this without particular drama. The war god wounded again, retreating again. The outcome settled, not by force of will, but by the intervention of a higher authority who had decided enough was enough. What the story of Cycnus adds to the portrait of Ares and his children is something the tradition returned to in different forms across different myths, that the inheritance of war, passed to children who had no wisdom to govern it, tended to create precisely the kind of senseless violence that made war most terrible. Cycnus was not a general. He was not a protector of a city or a leader of armies fighting for a principle. He was a killer sitting on a sacred road, building a temple from bones, his father's nature distilled into its most purposeless form. Hercules killed him as part of the tradition's ongoing project of making the world more habitable, clearing the landscape of the monsters and dangers that prevented human life from organizing itself into something stable. That Ares responded by defending his son and then retreated when wounded, and that Zeus simply ended the matter with thunder. This sequence tells a familiar story in miniature. The war god's anger was real. His capacity to sustain the fight against someone who had both skill and divine approval working in their favor was limited. The outcome was never really in question. The broader picture of Ares in the Greek tradition, isolated on Olympus, distrusted by his father, actively opposed by his mother, defeated in direct confrontation by his sister, worshipped most at the edges of the Greek world in Sparta and Thrace, is the picture of a divine principle that a culture acknowledged because it could not be ignored and kept at a certain distance because it could not be safely embraced. War was not something the Greeks denied. They were a people whose history was almost continuously shaped by armed conflict, whose epics were built around battles, whose male citizens were expected to fight when the city required it. They understood war from the inside. They knew what it cost, and what they encoded in the figure of Ares was specifically the aspect of war they found most disturbing, not the courage and solidarity and strategic intelligence that fighting could also produce, but the part that was purely destructive, that killed without purpose, that fed on its own violence and produced nothing afterward that could be called good. Homer's word for what Ares was, in Zeus's mouth in the Iliad, has been translated in different ways, but the sense is consistently something like the most hateful, the most detestable, not simply dangerous, not simply frightening, hateful, a word that implies the speaker has thought about this carefully and arrived at a settled judgment. Zeus says it about his own son. He says it in the presence of the other gods. He says it without apparent discomfort at the strangeness of a father speaking this way about his child, because in the tradition's account, Zeus was not primarily a father in the human sense, but a ruler, the governor of a divine order, and what Ares represented was a problem for that order. A god who could not be trusted with allies, who shifted loyalties with the chaos of the fighting itself, who had no constructive role in the peacetime life of the civilization. The gods were understood to be overseeing. This was not simply an embarrassment, it was a structural problem. The assembly kept him because war itself was inescapable. The assembly kept its distance because what he represented was the part of war that civilization exists, in part to contain. The Areopagus in Athens is a low hill of gray limestone rising just to the west of the Acropolis, close enough that a person standing on it looks directly across at the high rock where Athena's temple stands. The name means the hill of Ares, and the tradition held that it was named for the god after a trial conducted there, the first murder trial in the Greek world, with Ares in the dock before a jury of gods answering for the killing of Poseidon's son. He was acquitted. The site afterward became Athens's most important court, the place where cases of homicide were heard, where questions of life and death were put to formal deliberation. The hill that carried the god's name became, in other words, the place where the city made its most serious effort to subject violence to reason and law. That the Areopagus looks directly at the Parthenon, Athena's temple, built much later on the older sacred site, still one of the most complete expressions of the Greek understanding of order and intelligence and civic beauty, is a coincidence of geography that the city's history has made feel inevitable. The war god's hill, looking at the wisdom goddess's temple, the name that had been there from the beginning, before the temple rose, now framing it the way an old word frames a new idea. The cult presence of Ares in Athens was minimal compared to what the name of his hill might suggest. The city organized itself around other gods, Athena most of all, whose festival, the Panathenea, was the central celebration of the Athenian calendar, whose myth of founding the city by causing an olive tree to spring from the rock of the Acropolis was the story Athenians told about why their city was what it was. Ares had a temple in the Agora, reconstructed in the time of Augustus, and the Areopagus court conducted its business. His name was in the landscape. His presence in the active religious life of the city was limited to those functions and to the general acknowledgement, which the Greek tradition never omitted, that war existed and required its divine authority. The city did not celebrate war in the figure of Ares. They organized itself against the worst of what war could be, and it built its most visible monument to the goddess who represented the better part of what conflict, directed by intelligence and purpose, could serve. The necklace of Harmonia moved through the queens of Thebes across generations, and the tradition kept careful track of it. Euryphile, the wife of the seer Amphiaraus, was bribed with it to persuade her husband to join the expedition of the Seven against Thebes, a campaign she knew would end in his death. He went. He died. The necklace moved on. The pattern the tradition observed was not that the necklace was malevolent in itself. It was not described as a dark object, a thing of obvious danger, something that announced its nature. It was beautiful. That was the point. It was made by Hephaestus's hands, the same hands that were capable of the finest and most extraordinary craftsmanship in all the divine world, and its beauty was genuine. What it carried was subtler than a curse, more like a tendency, a direction in which the story around it inclined, the way that certain inherited tendencies in families are not destiny, but are also not nothing. The daughter of war and love had been given at her wedding a gift that expressed in miniature the tension of what she was the daughter of. Harmonia's name promised accord. Harmonia's necklace delivered something more complicated. There is a version of this that the ancient philosophical commentators found worth articulating, that the union of war and love as principles was not simply a mythological domestic arrangement between two gods who happened to be in each other's company. It was a statement about the structure of the world. Ares and Aphrodite were, in the Greek philosophical reading, opposing forces, destruction and creation, separation and union, the impulse that tears things apart, and the impulse that draws them together. Their children were what happens when those forces interact. Phobos and Deimos, the dark inheritors of their father's nature, fear and dread attending battle, as they always do. Harmonia, the possibility that opposing forces might resolve into something stable, something beautiful even, though the tradition was careful to note that this resolution was fragile and came with consequences. And in some versions, eros, desire, the force that moves people toward one another, and that is, the tradition observed, as ungovernable as war, and as likely to end in both joy and catastrophe. The two moons of Mars are still there, Phobos and Deimos, carrying their Greek names through the darkness of the outer space between the inner planets, orbiting a planet, that has carried a war god's name for as long as the Greeks looked up at the sky and noticed its reddish color and assigned to it the temperament of the god who presided over blood and battle. Phobos is slowly falling. Its orbit is decaying, not on any timescale that makes the fact feel urgent, but over the very long run, the moon is drawing closer to Mars, pulled by tidal forces, and the tradition of astronomy holds that in perhaps 30 to 50 million years, it will either impact the surface or break apart into a ring. Deimos, the outer moon, is slowly drifting away, its orbit gradually expanding. The two moons named for fear and dread are moving in opposite directions, one falling inward and one drifting outward, and between them the red planet continues its own orbit around the sun, unchanged by the long, slow fate of the moons that circle it. The Greeks who first named those qualities, the poet who set down Phobos and Deimos as the sons of Ares, the sons who attended battle and harnessed the war god's horses and rode beside him across whatever plane the fighting had reached, were not thinking about moons. They were thinking about what war does to the people who are asked to endure it. They had noticed that the fear comes before the fighting and the dread settles in afterward, or sometimes it is the other way around, and that neither feeling can be separated from the experience of armed conflict, the way you might separate an unfortunate side effect from an otherwise useful thing. They were native to it. They attended it the way sons attend a father. The tradition gave them names so they could be spoken about, thought about, placed within the larger structure of divine inheritance and mythological cause. They were feelings given faces. They were also, from the moment Asaph Hall pressed his eye to the eyepiece of the Washington refractor in August of 1877, the names of real things orbiting a real planet, dark and irregular, and moving steadily through the dark in their two different directions. What the tradition preserved in Ares, across the long passage from Hesiod's matter-of-fact listing to Homer's battlefield scenes, to Ovid's alternative account of a birth from a flower, to the philosophical readings of his children as the products of opposing forces, was a recognition that violence is not separate from the world, that humans and gods together inhabit, but native to it, as native as love and craft and grain and the turning of the sea. The Greeks did not love Ares for this. They did not celebrate him the way they celebrated Athena, whose festival filled Athens with processions and sacrifice and song, or Apollo, whose oracle at Delphi drew travelers from across the ancient world to ask questions about their futures. They kept him at his distance and acknowledged him and built, in the shadow of his hill, a court where they could try to do what the tradition shows the gods so rarely managed to do with him, subject his domain to judgment, to argument, to the slow deliberative process of a community deciding together what is permitted and what is not. Harmonia's name is still what it has always meant. In the Greek, harmonia, the fitting together of things that might otherwise be in opposition, the resolution of tension into something that holds, the accord that emerges when opposing forces find a ratio in which to rest. The tradition gave the daughter of the most violent Olympian and the goddess of love this name, and then gave her a long and difficult story, and a necklace that was beautiful and complicated, and a wedding that was the last occasion on which the gods all sat together among human beings on earth.